All right, hello, welcome back. Today we're going to continue on with our series on World War I with a lecture that focuses on the United States and how we end up being dragged into World War I. So where we had left off with the last lecture was that Woodrow Wilson and the United States decided on this policy of neutrality. Wilson did not want to get involved with the ancient hatreds of the old world. Meaning, he's looking at Europe and he's saying, you guys are over there, we're way over here on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. This sounds like your problem, not our problem. Now, the London Declaration of 1909 ends up being a very important document. This declaration had outlined the terms of neutrality and said that if a country like the United States wanted to remain neutral in times of war, that they had to abide by certain stipulations. So those stipulations were, one, they could not shelter ships in their ports, meaning that the United States could not shelter British ships, Austro-Hungarian ships, German ships, French ships, that these are all combatant nations, and our ports must not house any of their ships. We were not doing so we were abiding by that stipulation. The next stipulation was that the United States could not train troops. Now, we were not mobilizing our military at the time, so we were abiding by that stipulation as well. In addition, we were not training British troops, nor were we training German troops. The third stipulation was that we could not sell weapons and munitions to either side. So we could not, the U.S. government could not sell weapons and munitions to the Allied powers or the Central powers. But private companies could. And this is important. While the U.S. government could not sell weapons and munitions to either the Allied powers or the Central powers, American companies profited quite nicely off of World War I. In fact, from 1914 to 1916, American companies trade in munitions had increased from $40 million in 1914 all the way up to $1.3 billion in 1916. Likewise, private banks in this country had issued loans in excess of $27 million to the Central powers and $2.2 billion to the Allied powers. And remember, loans are not just given for free. Borrowers have to pay interest for the right to be lent money. So we were issuing them money, but when they paid back their debts, they were paying back their debts to us and then some. So we ended up making millions of dollars off of the fact that we were giving money to both sides in this war. But once again, to draw an important distinction, these were private companies and private banks. They were not associated with the American government. So let's take a look at how things look in 1918. So this is the same map that I had shown you in the last lecture, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. This is more just review at this point. The three main central powers in this war were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and they had faced off against the Allied powers, the main ones being Russia, Great Britain, which would be this island, France, and then to some extent Italy. So, how was America's neutrality threatened? Well, from the early days of the war, you had the British Navy had enforced a strict blockade of German ports using mines and patrols. So I included this map here, and if you see this map, let me point out a few things. You can see this is the island of Great Britain. Over here in brown, you see the edge of the German Empire. What you'll notice is there's not a lot of coastland here. So if the Germans were to be trading with other countries during this war, any ships would have to pass through this channel and then trade with the Germans at these ports over here. Well, the British knew this, and so what they tried to strategically do is strangle and prevent them from trading with neutral nations. So this red line here represents the primary British naval blockade. They had stationed their navy, all of their ships, around here so that neutral ships could not get through and trade with the German Empire. You also had a distant blockade over here in the North Sea and in the English Channel. So the British went to great lengths to try to cut off the Germans from the outside world. In response, the German Navy had to fight back. So they used submarines that they had called undersea boats or U-boats to fight this blockade and deter the Allies from trading with neutral nations as well. So you would have German submarines stationed all around this British naval blockade, and they would try to sink British ships. And then furthermore, submarines would make their way out here and try to prevent neutral nations from trading with Great Britain as well. So the terms of the London Declaration had allowed both sides, the Allies and the Central Powers, to stop neutral ships in order to search and seize, meaning take, contraband. Contraband are items used exclusively for military use. But there was protocol to this. So I want you to imagine that this is a German submarine, and then you had a British merchant or trading vessel. Now, a merchant vessel is not going to be heavily armed. So you might have this German submarine would surface, meaning come above water, and then threaten this merchant vessel. Let's say the Germans have accused the British of having contraband on board this merchant vessel, saying, we know you have guns, we know you have ammunition on board. Well, what you would typically see is the German submarine would then escort this British ship to port and then unload all of that contraband into Germany. Now, this system worked because merchant vessels posed really no threat to German submarines. But the issue of identifying what ships were neutral and which were not neutral were traditionally identified by a flag. Well, the British knew that if they were to fly not the British flag from their ship, but rather the American flag, then the Germans would mistaken their ship for an American ship. So the British could then sneak up on German submarines or German ships and then stage a surprise attack on those German ships. The Germans respond to this by sinking merchant vessels regardless of flag, because the Germans are thinking, well, we can't trust that this ship flying an American flag is actually an American ship. And because we don't know if they're actually an American ship, we have to sink this vessel in order to protect our submarine. Well, this had led to the sinking of the Lusitania. On May 7th, 1915, a German submarine sank the Lusitania, one of Britain's most famous passenger liners. So I want you to think of it as like Britain's Titanic. The Germans did not allow passengers to disembark prior to sinking the ship. And in total, 1,196 people died, including 128 Americans. Now, this event had outraged the American public, and you had Woodrow Wilson was criticized by two groups of people for his response to the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. You had those who favored intervention in World War I, like ex-president Teddy Roosevelt and Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. They argued that American lives were taken, we need to respond with strength, we must declare war on the Central Powers. Woodrow Wilson chooses not to declare war, which is kind of ironic because the second group of people that he was heavily criticized by were those who did not want to go to war. So you might be thinking, why would those who did not want to go to war and wanted to remain neutral criticize Woodrow Wilson when Woodrow Wilson chose not to go to war and to remain neutral? Well, they had argued that if Wilson did not place restrictions on Americans' travel to war zones, then this is going to happen again and again. That Americans are inevitably going to die. And when Americans do die, we will be dragged into this war. And Woodrow Wilson had believed in Americans' freedom to travel wherever they wanted to, including war zones. So he never enacted restrictions that faction had desired. So what Wilson did do was he sent strong notes of protest to Germany and warned that any further attacks would result in the United States entering World War I. The Germans, fearing that the United States was going to enter World War I on the side of the Allies, had decided that they were going to suspend unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning that the Germans would try to distinguish neutral ships from combatant ships from here on out. That they were not going to sink neutral ships. They were not going to endanger the lives of non-combatants. So Wilson had campaigned for president in 1916 under this slogan, Wilson, he kept us out of war. And you can see on this car here, this is like a campaign vehicle for Wilson. It says, vote for Wilson. Over here, it says, who keeps us out of war? Well, that was Wilson's selling point, that he did not bring us into this war. He kept us out of war. So why did he finally declare war? Well, in 1917, anxious that defeat would come quickly if trade between Britain and the United States continued, the German government announced that it was resuming unrestricted submarine warfare. So I know that I just jumped one slide and they're now resuming it again. But know that 2 years end up going by before the Germans announce that they are going to resume this old policy. Wilson responds by cutting off diplomatic relations with Germany. Diplomatic relations are when politicians engage in political discussions about international relations with each other. Wilson receives permission from Congress to begin arming American merchant ships. So Congress votes and approves Wilson's request to start placing weapons onto American ships that would typically be used for trading purposes. Now, also in 1917, the United States learns through British intelligence that Germany's foreign minister, a guy by the name of Arthur Zimmerman, had made offers to the Mexican government to return the so-called lost provinces of Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas if it entered the war on Germany's side. So the thought process here was that if Germany can preoccupy the United States with a war on our side of the ocean, then it would buy them some time to win the war over in Europe. So here you have a German devil that is trying to bribe a Mexican man with money, and then also with those states, those lost provinces, if Mexico enters the war on Germany's side. So if Mexico invades the United States. Now you can tell this is a German devil because he's got this like little pointy fixture on top of his head. That's the same type of pointy fixture that would be on top of the helmets of all German troops in World War I. Over here, you have the Zimmermann telegram. This is the exact telegram that was intercepted by the British and then given to the United States. This code, once it was broken, had exposed this German plot. So this was the final straw. This provoked Wilson to appear before Congress and ask for a declaration of war. At this point, Congress approves the request. So the last thing that we're going to talk about today is the 14 points. So 9 months after the United States enters World War I, Wilson presents his vision for peace, which he hoped would end war and prevent further conflicts. Now you'll notice that I didn't say end the war. Wilson was not looking to just end World War I. Wilson was looking to create a framework that would forever end war. So several of the principles of the 14 points included eliminating secret treaties, so countries could no longer engage in secret talks with each other. The press, meaning the media, had to be allowed to report on relations that countries had with each other. The freedom of the seas, so no country had ownership over any ocean or sea or lake, or that all the seas were international territory. Free trade, that's no country should be preventing other countries from trading. Disarmament, so all countries had to reduce their militaries. And then the last two being self-rule, sometimes referred to as self-determination. Woodrow Wilson believed that ethnic groups such as the Poles, the Czechs, the Slovaks, they deserved their own nation, that they deserved independence from their imperial oppressors. And then lastly, and most importantly, Wilson believed in a League of Nations, this multilateral organization that would cooperate with each other and then solve conflicts, international conflicts, peacefully through talks as opposed to war. Here you can see Woodrow Wilson in this cartoon, and then it says, "Make the world safe for democracy." Woodrow Wilson, that was his justification for entering World War I. Not only was it the continuation of unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram, but Wilson also wanted to make the world safe for democracy. And then here you have the Allies, which was this little kid, and Wilson is looking over at this little kid and going like tut tut tut, because this little kid is not actually reading what he's supposed to be reading. Instead, this little kid is reading something that reads, "To the victor belongs the spoils." And you'll hear that at times. To the victor goes the spoils means that the losers of the war have to turn over land and resources to the victors. That the victors, because they are the winners, they get these spoils or as reward for winning a war. Wilson's clearly disapproving of that mindset. He wants to make the world safe for democracy. He wants these principles of the 14 points to be enacted. All right, well, that's all I got for you today. Hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.